Hi Year 10s, this is the follow-up lesson to our last lesson, which on Simon Armitage's poem Remains. This one we start to dig a bit deeper into the poem itself. So you're going to need a copy of the poem in front of you, either from your anthology or from the last lesson. Or you can look it up on genius.com or a number of other websites out there. So the first task for you, the starter, is there are 9 words and phrases on the screen here. Can you explain what they literally mean? So there are 9 words or phrases and you need to explain what they actually mean. So when you're ready to start, pause this video, give it a go, and then come back for the next slide. Okay, so I hope you've looked at some of these and realised that a lot of some colloquial language and some figurative language, and the idea that looters could suggest both rioters or thieves or burglars or something like that, and letting fly is almost throwing something or shooting something with kind of wild abandon. To be 6 feet under is obviously a phrase that means to be dead. Near to the knuckle, so near to the knuckle is a phrase that might mean something that's painful or something that is quite close to being rude or offensive. So lots of different multiple meanings for some of these words, but most of them have only 1 or 2 clear definitions that when you say it, people understand what it means. So to leg it is obviously to run away from something. Yeah. Okay, so that's some of the answers for task number 1. Task number 2 is split into 2 parts. So firstly, you need to review the poem. So read over the poem again and answer these 4 or maybe 5 questions if you're feeling ambitious. So we're looking at the poem as a whole. So holistically, what do you think the poem is about? How does the poem make you feel? And you have to try and be a bit more detailed in your answer to that. What does the poem make you think of? What do you imagine as you read the poem? And lastly, why do you think the poet might have written this poem? So I'd like you to pause this again and then answer these questions in your book before we come back to the second part of this task. Okay, the second part is there is a short, there was quite a long documentary, an hour and 15 minutes, that's really worth a watch, that relates back to the motivation behind this poem and some others in the anthology, which is about those people who are left behind, those we aren't dead, the ones that have been left behind from conflict and the effect the conflict has had on them as individuals and as soldiers. So I'm only asking you to watch 5 minutes of it, but you can watch the whole documentary, and it is really moving, it is really powerful. It tells you quite a lot about Simon Armitage's anthology as much as the poetry we're looking at. So worth a watch, but for this task you just need to go and watch those 5 minutes and then come back. Okay, so hopefully you've got an idea about some of the stories that have created the poem Remains. If you watch the whole documentary, you'll have more of a story about some of the conflicts that are referred to in the poetry we're looking at. So particularly War Photographer is a good example of the number of conflicts that it covers. It covers probably 4 or 5 different ones throughout its length. In this task now, we looked at the poem holistically, we looked at what's inspired it, and now we're looking at being more analytical. So we're analysing poetry is a really key skill that you need to get used to and able to apply it to a number of different poems and techniques. So we're going to start with a quotation together. So this little short one here, which is, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Now this is a really good quote to use, and I'll show you why. It starts off with and, so the yellow word and, as if the narrator is telling a story, and it's just another detail of many. So and one thing after another. Okay. We've noticed at the start of this poem it begins in the middle of the story, which is a technique called in media res, and allows the reader to feel like it's part of, or they are part of a longer tale, and this is just a snippet of that, and the action is already taking place, which is always actually quite a good way of writing creatively as well, to drop people straight into the action. So one of them in green, it sounds quite vague, like the memory that is being recollected here is not quite clear. So one of them, maybe there's more than one, not sure. You know, it's quite lackadaisical. And then Lexit is the colloquial language we touched on at the beginning. Suggesting the narrator's either relaxed about recounting the story because he can use colloquial language, it's no big deal. It's not a particularly special occasion. Maybe the person he's telling it to, it's quite an informal conversation. So it retells it in a very casual way, which might tell you a lot about the narrator's feelings towards the event he's retelling. So the idea that, oh, it's just some guy, legs up the road, not a big thing to get worried about. But perhaps that isn't going to remain the case as the poem continues. And lastly, I picked up on a technique which is a plosive. It's a repeated P or B sound, which makes a phrase have particular impact, and that repetition as well of that P sound draws our attention to it, like shining a spotlight on this phrase. Possibly armed, probably armed, possibly not, and that makes us feel the narrator is even unsure about whether the looter is armed, and maybe not even that concerned. So probably armed, possibly not. The element of doubt suddenly springing up. So that particular phrase, or that particular line, if you like, starts to build an understanding that we have of the narrator as being a bit unreliable, perhaps, but also one who seemed confident and casual, but this element of doubt and lack of self-assurance comes in at the end. So that, as exploding a quote, is quite simplistic. We looked at how does it begin, maybe what's the next thing that's said, where's some techniques we can look at. So we look at colloquial language and plosives. So we're pulling out little aspects of it, but it's really important we start trying to analyse as much of it as we can, a small chunk at a time. The idea of up the road we could have analysed, again, very casual, very dismissive, up the road somewhere. It wasn't on a particular street, it wasn't in a particular town, it was just up the road. Again, making it feel very casual, very relaxed, very nondescript. So the next time it's up to you to try and do the same thing. So we've hit this looter a dozen times and he's there on the ground sort of inside out. Now I've highlighted the four sections of that quote you need to have a deeper look at. So to begin with, how does it start? You need to write a sentence here about how does the poem start and what does that tell us. Then the word looter, what could this key word infer? You need to explain what that word might mean and what that tells us about the situation or the narrator. Then when it says a dozen times, ask yourself, why is this less precise than it could be? Why does he not remember how many bullets he's fired? And what does that tell us about the narrator? So another answer for that one. And then lastly, why might the narrator be intentionally vague? So when it says sort of inside out, when he's describing the looter who's been shot, why might the narrator be intentionally vague? So answering those four questions that relate to the colour-coded highlighted parts of that line. And lastly, the stretch task for that is, can you identify any poetic techniques in this line and suggest the purpose of using them? So what might the impact on the reader be? What might be the message from the poet be? That's that part of the task. Once you've finished that, come back just for a little quick recap on what we need to do next. Okay, so we did the first one together. Sorry, I showed you the first one, and the second one we did together, as I've shown you what to focus on and what questions to answer. Now the next one is you need to pick one of these two key quotations and try and explode it in a similar way. You need to find 4 or 5 aspects of that quotation that you think are worth digging into a bit deeper. So the first one, it says, dream and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. So how could you analyse that in 4 or 5 words or phrases? The second one, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. Look again at what techniques there are, how does it start, what are important or interesting phrases you could look at. So your task now is to pick one of those 2 quotations and explode it in a similar way. So in the end of this task, you'll now have in your book the one that I did, the one that we did, and the one that you did. Okay, the final task, so now you should have in your books a breakdown of some of the phrases and colloquial language from the very start of this lesson. You'll have 3 quotations that have been exploded, And now you're going to use those exploded quotations to answer the following question. How does Armitage show the effect of conflict on a soldier? So make sure you write down the question, of course, and try and answer it structured in a way that I've built for you here. So if you'll notice the bold words, that's our petal paragraph. So starting out with a clearly expressed point, answer the question. So what do you think, what is your first instinct telling you? What do you think that Armitage is doing, and what does he believe about conflict and its effect on a soldier? So very quickly, your point, perhaps 1 or 2 sentences, needs to summarize and bring about your thoughts and your answers very clearly and very quickly. So then carefully chosen evidence from the quotations, or the poem as a whole, means we've got to start looking at which of the 3 exploded quotations could you rely on to help answer your question, and start with that one. So start by choosing one of those quotations and figure out how you can incorporate that into your answer to relate your evidence back to the question. Then referring to techniques you've noticed. In your exploded quotations, you may have spotted some techniques, you may not, and you may need to go back to the poem to find a relevant technique that you think can help you answer this question. Then some of the analysis from exploded quotations. You need to figure out which of those things, which of the questions you've answered, or which of the analysis I've provided you with, can actually help support your point. So choose something there and to incorporate and rewrite and redraft so that when it appears in this essay answer, it makes sense. And lastly, link your ideas back to what the effect the poem has on the readers. So always think about the idea of a poem being spoken or said aloud, and how that makes the reader feel or think. So link your idea, specifically your point and the question, back to how it makes the reader feel. So once you've written your answer for that, you can upload it to Google Classroom or type it straight in. I'll then come back and give you a score of 5. So if you've done all those 5 points that are listed here, then that means you get a 5 out of 5. If you've done 2 or 3, that's what you'll get. So that's it for today. Hopefully that helps you to start developing a better understanding of remains and how that life on the front lines has been presented by Simon Armitage. I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great break. Until then, see you soon.